What would you do if your child vanished without a trace, and the person responsible played mind games with the very authorities trying to find them? In the early 1990s, a seemingly ordinary man turned out to be a monster in disguise, responsible for the abduction and murder of innocent children. Yet, even after his confession, the bodies remained hidden. This is the chilling story of Louis Lent, a man whose cruelty extended far beyond his heinous acts. How did he manipulate the system, torment the victims' families, and evade justice for so long? In this video, we'll delve into the chilling case that continues to baffle law enforcement and explore the mysteries that remain unsolved. What makes a serial killer keep secrets even when they've already been caught? What kind of darkness compels someone to withhold the truth, forcing families to live in a state of agonizing uncertainty? This is the story of Louis Lent, a man whose horrific crimes spanned years and left unanswered questions, still haunting investigators and victims' families decades later. Louis Lent was convicted of murdering two children, 12-year-old Jimmy Bernardo and 12-year-old Sara Ann Wood. But one chilling mystery remains. Where is Sara Ann Wood's body? Today, we dive into the twisted mind of a convicted serial killer who, despite being behind bars, still holds secrets that may never be revealed. Jimmy Bernardo was just 12 years old, a boy with his whole life ahead of him. He had spent the day in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, watching a movie at the local cinema. But on October 22, 1990, he would never make it home. Jimmy's parents reported him missing that same night, sending the small town of Pittsfield into panic. Days turned into weeks, and police found no trace of Jimmy. The Bernardo family was shattered. They waited by the phone, hoping for any news that might lead them to their son. A month later, hunters stumbled upon Jimmy's body, discarded like trash on a rural road in Newfield, New York, 200 miles away from Pittsfield. Jimmy had been brutally murdered. His disappearance and tragic death left investigators searching for answers. But for years, there was no trace of his killer. The case grew cold, and the town's hope of finding justice for Jimmy slowly faded. 2 years after Jimmy's disappearance, another boy went missing. Jamie Lusher, 16 years old, was last seen on November 6, 1992. Jamie, a teenager with disabilities, had been biking to his grandmother's house in Westfield, Massachusetts. He was close with his family, often riding his bike through town to visit relatives. 6 days later, his bike was found in a field at the end of a dead-end road. But there was no sign of Jamie. His family was desperate for answers, but just like Jimmy Bernardo, Jamie seemed to have vanished without a trace. Investigators feared the worst but had no solid leads. Sara Ann Wood was the kind of girl who lit up a room with her smile. At just 12 years old, she was full of life, loved by her family and friends. On the warm summer day of August 18, 1993, she left Vacation Bible School to ride her bike home, a short trip in her small town of Sauquoit, New York. But Sara never made it back. Her bike was discovered hidden in brush, just half a mile from her family's home. Panic set in quickly, and a massive search began. Volunteers, law enforcement, and even strangers from neighboring towns joined in to find Sara. As days passed with no sign of her, hope began to dwindle. Sara's family was devastated. For weeks, they clung to the hope that Sara might still be alive. But deep down, they feared she had met a tragic fate. As the days turned into months, the case grew colder, just like Jimmy Bernardo's and Jamie Lusher's. But then, 5 months after Sara disappeared, there was a break in the case. A man named Louis Lent attempted to abduct 12-year-old Becky Savarese while she walked to school in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. Luckily, Becky managed to escape, and Lent was arrested soon after. Investigators quickly realized that this was no ordinary abduction attempt. During his interrogation, Lent confessed not only to trying to kidnap Becky, but to the murders of both Jimmy Bernardo and Sara Ann Wood. He described in chilling detail how he lured, kidnapped, and killed the children. He even led investigators to the location where he claimed to have buried Sara's body, deep in the Adirondack Mountains. Armed with a hand-drawn map from Lent, search teams combed the dense, snow-covered forests, looking for any sign of Sara's remains. After more than 50 days of grueling searches, they found nothing. Once again, the Wood family was left with more questions than answers. They knew Lent had killed Sara, but without her body, they were denied the closure they so desperately needed. In early January 1994, when Louis Lent was arrested for attempting to abduct Becky Savarese, the investigation took a dramatic turn. During intense questioning, Lent confessed to the murders of both Jimmy Bernardo and Sara Ann Wood. His chilling admission gave authorities hope that they could finally bring closure to the Wood family. However, Lent's confession came with a disturbing twist. He began manipulating the authorities by providing vague details and conflicting information about the location of Sara's body. Lent claimed he buried her in the Adirondack Mountains near Raquette Lake, but when a large-scale search was conducted in the bitter winter of 1994, no trace of Sara was found. The search stretched for more than 50 days, and despite the involvement of numerous law enforcement officers and volunteers, the snowy landscape yielded no results. Lent's tactics became clear. He enjoyed the power he held over the investigators and the Wood family. By withholding vital information, he prolonged the suffering of everyone involved, showing a complete lack of remorse for his heinous crimes. In the years following Lent's conviction, investigators made several more attempts to locate Sara Ann Wood's remains. Each time, Lent provided new details, only for the search to end in disappointment. He recanted his confessions, led investigators on wild goose chases, and continued to exploit the agony of the families he had already devastated. In 1996, Lent pled guilty to the kidnapping and murder of Sara Ann Wood, but he refused to reveal the location of her body. The Wood family, despite having a conviction, were left with an empty grave and unanswered questions. They pleaded with Lent in court, asking him to give them the closure they so desperately needed. But Lent remained silent, his cruelty extending beyond the physical violence he inflicted on his victims to the emotional torment he caused their families. This pattern repeated itself in 2013, when Lent confessed to the murder of Jamie Lusher, the 16-year-old who had disappeared in 1992. Lent claimed he disposed of Jamie's body in Greenwater Pond in Massachusetts, but despite extensive efforts, Jamie's body was never recovered. Once again, Lent recanted his confession, leaving yet another family without answers. The fruitless searches and Lent's manipulative behavior only deepened the frustration of law enforcement. Each time they thought they were close to finding Sara, Jamie, or other potential victims, Lent would retract his statements or lead them to dead ends. His ability to string along the investigation for decades became a source of public outrage and pain for the victims' families. The emotional toll of Lent's crimes extended far beyond the courtroom. For the Wood, Bernardo, and Lusher families, the pain of losing their children was compounded by the uncertainty of their final resting places. Sara Wood's father, Bob Wood, became a public figure in the fight against child abduction. His 600-mile bike ride to Washington, D.C. in 1995 helped raise awareness for missing children, and his efforts continued through the annual Ride for Missing Children, which he and his son, Dusty, participated in for years. Bob Wood's tireless advocacy was a testament to his love for his daughter, but it also reflected the unrelenting heartache he carried. The Wood family, like the Bernardo and Lusher families, had to live with the knowledge that Lent could provide closure but chose not to. They were left with no graves to visit, no final goodbyes to say, only the hope that one day they might find their loved ones. For law enforcement, the Lent case became a haunting reminder of the evil that can exist behind a seemingly ordinary facade. Investigators spent years working on the case, sifting through false leads, enduring the emotional strain of Lent's manipulations, and facing public pressure to find answers. Many of the officers involved in the searches felt the weight of failure each time they came up empty-handed, despite their best efforts. The psychological impact on both families and investigators was profound. For the families, it was a wound that could never fully heal. For law enforcement, it was a case that lingered in their minds long after they had moved on to other investigations. The loss of young lives, coupled with the inability to bring them home, left a permanent scar on all involved. Louis Lent's reign of terror in the early 1990s left a lasting impact not just on the victims' families, but on entire communities. The fear that had gripped Pittsfield, Westfield, and Sauquoit during the height of the disappearances never fully dissipated. Parents became more vigilant, communities grew more cautious, and the shadow of Lent's crimes lingered in the places where he had once stalked his victims. The image of a seemingly harmless janitor transforming into a monster capable of such unspeakable acts sent chills through the public. His ability to blend into society, to go unnoticed while harboring such dark intentions, made him the embodiment of every parent's worst nightmare. Even after his arrest, the fear he instilled lived on. For those who knew Lent personally, the shock was even greater. He had been a fixture in the local community, working at the cinema where Jimmy Bernardo was last seen. To think that someone so ordinary could be responsible for such extraordinary evil was a reality that many struggled to accept. Over the years, Lent became a symbol of the unsolved mysteries surrounding child abductions. His refusal to disclose the locations of his victims' bodies left a cloud of uncertainty hanging over the cases. As he sat in prison, serving life sentences for his crimes, he continued to wield power over those who sought justice, keeping his secrets locked away. The case of Louis Lent is a tragic example of how the criminal justice system, even when it secures convictions, can still leave questions unanswered. Despite Lent's confessions, the remains of Sara Ann Wood and Jamie Lusher remain missing, a painful reminder of the limits of the law in providing closure to grieving families. For the families of Lent's victims, the fight for justice and answers continues. Bob Wood, Dusty Wood, and many others refuse to let their loved ones be forgotten. Their resilience in the face of such profound loss is a testament to the strength of the human spirit. The story of Louis Lent serves as a chilling reminder of the evil that can lurk beneath the surface of ordinary life. It's a case that highlights the importance of vigilance, the dedication of law enforcement, and the unyielding love of families who refuse to give up on the search for truth. As we reflect on these tragedies, it's important to honor the victims and their families by continuing the conversation about child abduction and the need for ongoing efforts to prevent such crimes. The legacy of Sara Ann Wood, Jimmy Bernardo, and Jamie Lusher is not one of victimhood, but of the fight for justice, closure, and the enduring hope that one day the answers will finally be found.